Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1. A perfectly ruined evening. Agatha Raisin stared into the unforgiving, brightly lit mirror of her cottage bedroom and decided that gravity was a personal insult. She leaned closer, pressing a manicured finger against her jawline, pulling the skin tight. Much better. If only she could walk around all evening, holding her face exactly like that. Dropping her hand, she sighed, as the slight slackness returned. It was grossly unfair. She had spent a fortune on her new emerald green silk dress, an undeniably stunning piece she had bought in London, which clung to her curves with the ruthless precision of a bespoke par campaign. She had also starved herself for 2 days just to zip it up. Tonight was the annual Carsely Village Benevolent Fund Supper, an event that usually promised nothing more thrilling than overcooked roast beef, aggressively competitive flower arrangements, and the suffocating smell of damp wool. But tonight was different. Tonight, Julian Vance would be there. Julian was a newly retired architect who had recently moved into the old rectory. He possessed a full head of silver hair, a charming smile, and, most importantly, he was single. Agatha had spent the better part of 3 weeks engineering accidental meetings with him at the village shop, enduring agonizingly boring conversations about Cotswold stone preservation just to secure his attention. Tonight, she fully intended to sit next to him, dazzle him with her sharp London wit, and cement her status as the most desirable woman in the village. Agatha gave her short dark hair a final aggressive spritz of hairspray, grabbed her designer clutch, and marched out the door. The crisp evening air of the Cotswolds hit her face, a sharp contrast to the bubbling anxiety in her chest. She teetered down the cobblestone lane on stilettos that were completely impractical for a rural village, cursing every pebble underfoot. By the time she pushed open the heavy oak doors of the village hall, the supper was already in full swing. A loud hum of chatter washed over her, punctuated by the clinking of cheap wineglasses. Agatha stood at the entrance for a moment, waiting for heads to turn. A few did, mostly the elderly parish council members who looked at her plunging neckline with a mixture of disapproval and cardiac concern. But Julian Vance was not looking at her. Agatha's heart plummeted, and then immediately ignited into a fiery ball of irritation. Julian was standing near the makeshift bar, laughing openly, and hanging on to his every word, looking effortlessly thin and disgustingly radiant in a simple, unstructured linen dress that screamed, "I just threw this on," was Fiona Bradley. Fiona was 32, ran an organic bakery from her kitchen, and had been a thorn in Agatha's side since she moved to Carsely 6 months ago. She was the kind of woman who never wore makeup, but always looked glowing, and who spoke in a soft, breathy voice that made men lean in like pathetic, thirsty puppies. Agatha squared her shoulders, plastered on a smile that didn't reach her beady bear-like eyes, and marched over. "Julian, how lovely to see you," Agatha boomed, her voice easily cutting through Fiona's soft murmurs. Julian turned, his eyes widening slightly. "Agatha, good heavens, you look very bright tonight." "It's emerald, Julian." "Emerald silk," Agatha corrected, shooting a sidelong glance at Fiona. "Hello, Fiona. I see you've come as a flour sack." Fiona blinked, her big doe eyes welling with immediate, practiced hurt. "Oh, it's eco-linen, actually, Agatha. But you looked lovely. So brave, wearing something that fitted at. Well, you know, it takes real confidence." Agatha's hands tightened around her clutch. Before she could deliver the verbal decapitation Fiona so richly deserved, the shrill ring of a spoon, tapping against a glass, echoed through the hall. The vicar, looking nervous and slightly sweaty, stood at the head of the long, U-shaped dining table. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could all take our seats. The caterers are ready to serve the soup, and we have a wonderfully full house tonight." Agatha maneuvered herself smoothly, intending to slide into the chair beside Julian, but Fiona was faster, slipping into the seat to his right with the agility of a weasel. Gritting her teeth, Agatha was forced to take the seat directly across from them. To her left was Mr. Bogle, who was profoundly deaf and chewed with his mouth open, and to her right was an empty chair. "Who's missing?" Agatha demanded loudly, pointing a scarlet fingernail at the empty place setting next to her. "Oh, that's for Mr. Blackwood," whispered Missy Bloxby, the vicar's wife, who was seated across the table. She gave Agatha a sympathetic, apologetic smile. Agatha groaned internally. Marcus Blackwood was the newest plague upon the village. A ruthless property developer from London, he had recently bought the crumbling Carsely Manor and immediately started issuing eviction notices to the tenant farmers on the estate. He was universally despised, yet because he was exceptionally wealthy and held the lease to the village cricket pitch, everyone felt obligated to invite him to things. The bowls of thick, beige mushroom soup were distributed. Agatha stared at hers with disdain. She was just about to risk a sip when the heavy doors of the hall banged open. Marcus Blackwood strode in. He was a thick-set man in his 50s with a red face, a tightly tailored suit that looked expensive but uncomfortable, and an air of supreme arrogance. He didn't apologize for his late arrival. Instead, he handed his cashmere coat to a bewildered teenage volunteer and marched straight to the head of the table. Traffic on the M40. Blackwood barked by way of greeting, though everyone knew he lived less than a mile away. He pulled out the chair next to Agatha and dropped into it heavily. He smelled of expensive cologne and gin. "Evening, Agatha," he said, giving her a slow, appreciative once-over that made her want to hit him with her soup spoon. "Nice dress. Surprised you can breathe in it. It requires a certain class to pull off, Marcus." "You wouldn't understand," Agatha snapped, picking up her wine glass. Blackwood just chuckled darkly. He looked around the table, his eyes lingering on Julian, then Fiona, then the vicar. "Quite the cosy little gathering. Enjoy it while it lasts. Folks' rents are going up next quarter. Got to pay for the manor's new roof somehow." A stunned, horrified silence fell over the table. Mr. Bogle continued to slurp his soup. Oblivious, Fiona looked like she might cry. Julian's jaw tightened. Blackwood smirked, clearly enjoying the tension. He reached for his goblet of red wine, swirling it lazily. "Cheers to progress," he mocked, raising the glass. He took a large gulp. Agatha watched him, her irritation boiling over. She was about to tell him exactly where he could shove his rent increases, when Blackwood suddenly stopped. He lowered the glass slowly. His thick fingers began to tremble. A strange, wet wheezing sound escaped his lips. "Marcus." Agatha frowned, leaning away as he abruptly dropped the goblet. The red wine shattered against the table, a dark crimson stain spreading rapidly across the white paper tablecloth and splashing directly onto the hem of Agatha's emerald silk dress. "Oh, for God's sake!" Agatha shrieked, jumping to her feet. "Look what you've done." But Blackwood wasn't looking at her dress. His hands flew to his throat. His face, usually a florid red, was turning a terrible mottled purple. He knocked his chair backward in a violent scramble, clawing at his own collar, his eyes bulging wide with an unnameable terror. He took one stuttering, frantic step away from the table, let out a dreadful, choked gasp, and collapsed face first onto the wooden floorboards. The hall erupted. Chairs scraped, people screamed, and Fiona began to wail openly into Julian's shoulder. The vicar rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the prone developer. Agatha stood perfectly still amidst the chaos. She looked down at the ruined hem of her terribly expensive dress, then at the lifeless body of Marcus Blackwood, the last guest to arrive. He wasn't breathing. Agatha felt a familiar, thoroughly inappropriate spark of adrenaline ignite in her chest. Her romantic evening was entirely ruined, her dress was stained, and the village of Carsely was about to be swarming with incompetent police officers. It was utterly infuriating. And yet, as Agatha stared at the overturned wine glass, her sharp eyes narrowed. "Traffic on the M40, he had said. But Agatha had noticed the damp earth clinging to the edge of his expensive Italian loafers. It hadn't rained in Carsely for 3 days. Marcus Blackwood had been lying, and now he was dead. Chapter 2. The indignity of incompetence. The village hall had transformed from a scene of lukewarm festivity into a circus of flashing blue lights. Hysterical whispering. Agatha sat on a folding plastic chair in the corner, a damp paper towel pressed furiously against the dark wine stain on her emerald silk. It was ruined. Completely, utterly, tragically ruined. Paramedics had come and gone, confirming what Agatha already knew: Marcus Blackwood was very dead. Now, the echoing space was occupied by uniformed officers who looked far too young to be dealing with anything more serious than a stolen bicycle. And Detective Inspector Wilkes. Wilkes was a man who wore his mediocrity like a badge of honor. He had a receding hairline, a patronizing smile, and the distinct air of a man who wanted to wrap this up in time to catch match of the day. So, Missy Raisin, Wilkes said, flipping open a small dog-eared notebook. He didn't bother looking up from his scribbling. You were sitting next to the deceased when he had his cardiac event. It wasn't a cardiac event, you fool, Agatha snapped, dropping the crumpled paper towel. He choked. He seized up. His face turned purple, not grey, and he dropped his wine glass just before it happened. It was the wine, Wilkes sighed. The heavy, exaggerated exhalation of a man dealing with a hysterical woman. Now, Agatha, let's not jump to television conclusions. The man was overweight, stressed, and red in the face before he even sat down. Heart attack. Classic presentation. Oh, really? Agatha stood up, towering over the seated inspector, despite her ruined hemline. Then explain the mud on his shoes. Wilkes blinked, finally looking up. Mud? He told the room he was stuck in traffic on the M40, but he was wearing expensive Italian loafers completely unsuited for country walking, and the edges of the soles were caked in damp, dark earth. It hasn't rained here in 3 days. He wasn't sitting in his car. He was tramping about somewhere in the damp, somewhere local. Wilkes looked momentarily thrown. He glanced over at the body, which was now covered by a thoroughly depressing grey blanket. Quickly he recovered his smugness. A puddle in the car park, I'm sure. Leave the detecting to the professionals, Mrs. Raisin. We'll wait for the coroner's report, but I confidently expect a natural cause. Now, if you'll excuse me. Agatha watched him waddle away, her blood boiling. It was bad enough that Marcus Blackwood had the audacity to die on her dress, but to have her keen observations dismissed by a man who looked like a slightly melted waxwork of a civil servant was intolerable. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Carsely was buzzing like a disturbed wasp nest. Agatha, claiming she desperately needed semi-skimmed milk, marched down to the village shop. Her real objective, of course, was to harvest the gossip. The bell above the door tinkled, announcing her arrival. The shop was packed. Mrs. Wellington, the postmistress, was leaning over the counter, whispering conspiratorially to Miss Sims, the spinster who practically lived at the church. Heard it was a massive stroke, Miss Sims was saying, her eyes wide with a thrill she was trying hard to disguise as pious sorrow, though one can't help but feel it's a sort of divine judgment, threatening to evict the Jenkins family just before Christmas. I heard he was poisoned, Agatha declared loudly, stepping up to the counter. The shop went dead, silent. 4 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her. Poisoned? Mrs. Wellington gasped, a hand fluttering to her pearls. Agatha, really? Inspector Wilkes said it was a heart attack. You shouldn't spread such morbid rumors. I'm not spreading rumors. I'm stating facts, Agatha said briskly, slamming a pint of milk onto the counter. He drank the wine. He choked. He died. And quite frankly, looking around this village, half of you had a motive to slip something into his glass. Miss Sims clutched her sensible leather handbag to her chest. Well, I never. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Mary, Agatha huffed, handing over a £10 note. He was going to raise the commercial rents on the whole high street. I saw the way you all looked at him last night. If looks could kill, he would have been dead before the soup was served. Agatha snatched her change and marched out, leaving a thoroughly scandalized silence in her wake. As she walked back up the lane, the crisp morning air did little to cool her temper. She hadn't wanted to get involved. She had retired to the Cotswolds for peace, quiet, and perhaps a dashing husband. Not murder, but the sheer incompetence of Inspector Wilkes grated on her nerves like cheap sandpaper. And then there was the deeply irritating way Julian Vance had been looking at Fiona Bradley, while the poor man was choking to death, as if Fiona was the one who needed comforting. Agatha paused at her front gate. Fine, she thought, her lips setting into a grim, determined line. If the police were going to be stubbornly blind, she would just have to find out the truth herself, if only to prove them all wrong. And, more importantly, to send a hefty dry cleaning bill to the murderer. Chapter 3. Blunt questions and bad manners. Agatha's decision to investigate was less a noble pursuit of justice, and more a stubborn refusal to let Inspector Wilkes have the last word. By Tuesday, the official police line remained natural causes pending toxicology, which Agatha interpreted as, "We're waiting for a machine to tell us what a woman of my intelligence already knows." She decided her first port of call should be the source of the evening's primary irritation, Fiona Bradley. If Marcus Blackwood had been up to something local before the dinner, the village's sweetheart of sourdough would likely have heard the crumbs of it. Besides, Agatha wanted to see if Fiona's eyes were still preternaturally moist. The Crusty Corner Bakery was a vision of Cotswold perfection that made Agatha want to scream. Bunches of dried lavender hung from the rafters, and the air smelled of cinnamon and smugness. Fiona was behind the counter, wearing an apron that managed to look chic rather than utilitarian. "Agatha," Fiona chirped, though her smile didn't quite reach her cheekbones. "How are you? I heard about your dress. Such a shame. It was so vibrant." "The dress is a write-off, Fiona, much like Marcus Blackwood," Agatha said, leaning over the counter and pointedly ignoring the tray of artisanal almond croissants. "I'm interested in what he was doing before he arrived at the hall. He told everyone he was on the M40, but he had mud on his shoes, the dark, clay-heavy kind you find down by the old mill streams." Fiona's hand, which had been reaching for a paper bag, paused mid-air. "The mill. Why would he be there? That's nowhere near the motorway." "Exactly, and he was late. Now, you're the village's unofficial bulletin board. Did Marcus have any private dealings with anyone near the water? Perhaps our charming newcomer, Julian?" Agatha threw Julian's name out like a baited hook. Fiona's face went a delicate shade of pink. "Julian? Of course not. Julian is an architect. He's been helping me with the plans for the new community orchard. Marcus was, well, he was a bully. He wanted to buy the orchard land to build luxury, executive cottages." Agatha's ears pricked up. "And did Julian have a problem with that?" "Everyone had a problem with it, Agatha," Fiona said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "But Marcus was particularly nasty to Julian at the parish council meeting last week. He threatened to report Julian to the architectural board for some technicality regarding his London firm's retirement. It was all very tense." Agatha felt a pang of disappointment. She didn't want Julian to be a suspect. She wanted him to be a suitor. But murder was an excellent way to ruin a reputation, and Marcus Blackwood seemed to have been a specialist in reputations. "And what about you, Fiona?" Agatha asked, her voice turning dangerously silk-like. "I hear Blackwood was planning to triple the rent on this shop. A little arsenic in the wine would certainly keep the overheads down, wouldn't it?" Fiona let out a tiny, horrified gasp. "Agatha Raisin, that is a monstrous thing to say. I was at the bar when the wine was poured. Everyone saw me. I was talking to the vicar's wife." "Talking is a marvelous distraction," Agatha countered, though she knew she was pushing her luck. "I'm just saying, people do desperate things when their organic flour supplies are threatened." Agatha exited the shop to the sound of Fiona's indignant sniffles, feeling a familiar sense of triumph. She hadn't found the killer yet, but she'd certainly stirred the pond. She spent the afternoon prowling the perimeter of the village hall. The caterers for the supper had been the Cotswold Kitchen, a firm from Evesham. Agatha made a mental note to call them and find out who had access to the wine crates, but her mind kept drifting back to the mud. She drove her Silver Sylvie down to the lower end of the village, where the River Windrush fed into a series of stagnant, muddy pools near the derelict mill. It was a lonely, damp place, shrouded by weeping willows. She climbed out of the car, her sensible and hideous rubber boots squelching in the mire. As she circled the old mill house, she spotted something. The grass was flattened, as if a large car had been parked there recently, and there, caught on a bramble bush near the water's edge, was a small, jagged piece of dark blue fabric. Agatha picked it up. It was expensive wool, the exact color and texture of the suit Marcus Blackwood had been wearing. "What were you doing down here, you greedy pig?" she muttered to the wind. A sudden rustle in the reeds made her jump. She spun around expecting a killer, but found herself staring at the weathered, grumpy face of Bill Wong, a young detective from the local force who actually tolerated Agatha, mostly because she reminded him of a particularly stubborn aunt. "Agatha," Bill said, sighing as he looked at the scrap of fabric in her hand. "I should have known you'd be down here poking around in the mud. Someone has to. Bill, Wilkes thinks Marcus died of a personality disorder. I'm finding evidence." "We're still waiting on the prelims, Agatha," Bill said gently, though his eyes were serious. "But between us," the paramedics noted a strange odor. Not quite bitter almonds, but something floral, synthetic, like a cleaning fluid or a very cheap perfume. Agatha thought of the expensive cologne Blackwood had been wearing. "He smelled of gin and money when he sat down next to me." "Well, whatever it was, it didn't just walk into his glass," Bill said. "Stay out of it, Agatha. If this was a poisoning, whoever did it is watching us right now, wondering who's getting too close." Agatha felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the damp mill air. She looked around at the silent trees. Every window in Carsely felt like an eye, and for the first time, her own pride felt like a very bright target. Chapter 4. The reluctant suspect. Agatha returned home to find her cat, Hodge, sitting on the kitchen counter with an air of profound judgment. She ignored him, dumped her muddy boots by the door, and poured herself a glass of gin large enough to float a small boat. The scrap of blue wool sat on her kitchen table like an accusation. If Marcus Blackwood had been at the mill shortly before the dinner, he hadn't been there for a scenic stroll. The mill was the site of a disputed planning application, a project Blackwood had been pushing through with the subtlety of a bulldozer. But who had he met there? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic knocking at her front door. Agatha straightened her sweater, checked her reflection, noting with a grimace that the Cotswold damp had turned her hair into a frizzled bird's nest, and opened the door. It was Julian Vance. He looked troubled, his silver hair slightly windswept, holding a bottle of wine like a peace offering. "Agatha," he said, his voice low and rich, "I hope I'm not intruding. I felt we didn't get a chance to speak properly after the horror of the dinner." "Julian, do come in," Agatha said, her heart doing a frantic little jig. She swept a pile of forensic-related notes off the sofa and gestured for him to sit. "It was a nightmare, wasn't it? My dress is a total loss." Julian sat, but he didn't look at ease. He set the wine on the coffee table. "It's more than the dress, Agatha. The village is whispering. They're saying you're convinced Marcus was murdered." Agatha leaned back, crossing her legs. "I don't just think it, Julian. I know it. The man was as healthy as a horse, a mean, bloated horse, but healthy nonetheless. And he was lying about his afternoon. He was down at the old mill." Julian flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of the muscles around his eyes, but to a woman who had spent decades reading the subtle tells of corporate rivals, it was loud as a shout. "The mill," Julian repeated. "Why do you say that?" "Because I found a piece of his suit on a bramble bush there," Agatha said bluntly. "And I noticed you looked a bit green when Fiona mentioned the planning application today. You were the architect for the community orchard project, weren't you? The one Blackwood was trying to kill." Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. "He wasn't just trying to kill the project, Agatha. He was trying to kill my career. He found out about a minor oversight in a London project I handled years ago. It was a nothing burger, a clerical error, but he was threatening to leak it to the press if I didn't withdraw the orchard plans. He wanted the mill land for his executive retreat." Agatha felt a pang of sympathy, followed immediately by a cold splash of suspicion. "So you met him there at the mill before the supper?" Julian looked up, his eyes pained. "Yes. He called me there at 4 o'clock. He wanted to gloat. He showed me the documents. He'd gathered he was vile, Agatha. He laughed at the idea of a community space. He said the only thing the people of Carsely deserved was a higher rent bill." "And then what?" Agatha pressed, leaning forward. "Did you fight verbally?" "Yes, But I left him there. He was perfectly fine when I walked away. He said he had one more guest to see before the dinner. Another guest. Agatha's mind whirred. Who? He didn't say. But as I was driving away, I saw a car heading down the track toward the mill. A small, white hatchback. Agatha frowned. Half the women in the village drove small, white hatchbacks. It was the unofficial uniform of the Cotswold mother. Julian, Agatha said softly, did you go near the wine crates at the village hall? Julian stood up abruptly, his face pale. Agatha, surely you don't think. I came here because I thought you, of all people, would understand what it's like to be bullied by a man like Blackwood. I didn't kill him. I'm a designer, not a murderer. I have to ask, Julian. I'm a detective. Agatha lied conveniently, forgetting she was actually a retired PR executive with a hobby. You're a nosy woman, Agatha, Julian said, his voice tight with disappointment. He headed for the door. I thought you were different from the rest of the gossips. I see I was wrong. He slammed the door behind him, leaving Agatha standing in the middle of her living room, feeling a sickening mix of professional triumph and personal misery. She had a lead, a mysterious second guest in a white car, but she had potentially blown her chances with the only eligible man in a 10-mile radius. She sat down and took a large gulp of gin. Men, she muttered to Hodge. Always so sensitive. She pulled her notepad toward her. Suspect Julian Vance. Motive blackmail. Suspect Fiona Bradley. Motive rent Ted busyness. Suspect the mystery guest car, white hatchback then. She added a fourth name, the vicar. It seemed ridiculous, but the vicar had been the one serving the wine, and Agatha had noticed something during the chaos. When Marcus had collapsed, the vicar hadn't looked surprised. He had looked relieved. Agatha tapped her pen against her chin. Tomorrow she would go to the church, not for the salvation of her soul that was a lost cause, but for the pursuit of a killer. And if she had to ruin another pair of shoes to do it, so be it. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Sacristy. The Church of St. Mary's was a study in ancient stone and perpetual chill. Agatha marched up the gravel path the following morning, her heels clicking with a rhythm that suggested she was coming for a confession, though not her own. She found the vicar, Mr. Alfie Bloxby, in the vestry. He was a kind, perpetually flustered man who looked as though he had been designed by nature to be bullied by parish committees. At the moment, he was polishing a silver chalice with a devotion that bordered on the frantic. Agatha, he exclaimed, nearly dropping the silver. I didn't expect to see you until Sunday. Or, well, ever, given your views on the liturgy. Don't get your hopes up, Alfie. I'm here about Marcus Blackwood, Agatha said, pulling out a wooden chair and sitting without being asked. You were the one pouring the wine at the bar, weren't you? The vicar's hand slowed. I was. It's part of the duty. A bit of hospitality to grease the wheels of charity. And did you see anyone near the glasses, someone who shouldn't have been there? Alfie sighed, setting the chalice down. Agatha, the hall was a swarm of people. But if you're asking if I saw someone drop a vial of poison into Marcus's cup, the answer is no. Though God forgive me, I can't say the village is mourning him. The man was a shark in a pond of minnows. Agatha leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. He was more than a shark, Alfie. He was a blackmailer. He was squeezing Julian Vance. Who else was he squeezing? You, perhaps. I noticed how relieved you looked when he went down. It wasn't the look of a man losing a parishioner. It was the look of a man losing a headache. The vicar's face went a startling shade of ashen grey. He sank into the chair opposite her, his shoulders slumping. Is it that obvious? Marcus had found out about the Restoration Fund. Not that I took any money. Heavens, no. But I mismanaged the accounts. I moved money from the roof fund to cover the heating bill without proper authorization. It was a technicality, but Marcus threatened to report it to the bishop. He wanted me to support his development at the mill. He said a word from the pulpit would quiet the dissenters. Agatha felt a surge of adrenaline. Everyone in this wretchedly picturesque village seemed to have a reason to want Blackwood dead. And do you drive a white hatchback, Alfie? A hatchback? No, I have that old blue Volvo. Why? Agatha ignored the question. Where is your wife, Margaret? She's at the Flower Guild meeting. Agatha, surely you don't think Margaret. I don't think anything yet, Alfie. I'm just collecting suspects like some people collect porcelain cats. Agatha left the church feeling more frustrated than ever. She had too many motives and not enough evidence. As she walked toward her car, she saw a flash of white in the distance, a small car parked near the village green. She hurried toward it, her heart thumping. It was a white hatchback, a late model, clean, and utterly nondescript vehicle. She peered through the window. On the passenger seat sat a stack of flyers for the community orchard project. The car belonged to Fiona Bradley. Agatha felt a cold prickle of realization. Fiona had claimed Julian was helping her with the orchard, but she hadn't mentioned meeting Blackwood at the mill. If Fiona had been the other guest Julian saw, it meant she had lied about her whereabouts before the dinner. Determined to catch the girl in a lie, Agatha drove straight to the crusty corner. But as she pulled up, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A tall, thin man in a dark suit was standing by the bakery door, speaking to a tearful Fiona. It was a man Agatha recognized from her London days. A high-end private investigator named Roy Silver had once mentioned him. He was a fixer for the wealthy. As Agatha stepped out of her car, the man turned. He had eyes like a shark, cold, black, and entirely devoid of humor. He gave Fiona a final, sharp nod and walked toward a sleek black car parked nearby. Agatha didn't wait. She intercepted Fiona just as she was retreating inside. "Who was that?" Agatha demanded, skipping the pleasantries. Fiona startled, her face blotchy from crying. "Just a solicitor. About the estate, Marcus's estate." "Nonsense," Agatha snapped. "Solicitors don't look like they bury bodies for a living." "That was a fixer, Fiona. What did Marcus have on you? Or better yet, what did you have on him?" Fiona's lip trembled. "I don't know what you're talking about, Agatha. Please, leave me alone. I have bread to bake." "You were at the mill, weren't you? At 4:30 on the day he died. Julian saw your car." Fiona froze. The doe-eyed innocence vanished, replaced by a sharp, jagged edges of desperation. "I went to beg him, Agatha. I went to tell him that if he raised the rent I'd lose everything. My shop, my home, my life. He just laughed at me. He told me I should have thought of that before I started playing house in a village I didn't belong in." "And did you kill him?" Fiona looked Agatha dead in the eye. "I wanted to. I truly did. But when I left him, he was sitting on a fallen log, drinking from a flask and checking his watch. He said he was waiting for his favorite disappointment." Agatha's brow furrowed. Favorite disappointment. It was a cruel, specific phrase. "Did you see who it was?" "No," Fiona whispered. "But as I drove away, I saw someone walking down the path. Not a car. Someone on foot, coming through the woods from the direction of the manor." Agatha let out a long breath. The circle was widening again. If the killer had come on foot, it meant they were someone very close, someone who knew the back ways and the hidden paths of Carsely. She turned to leave, but Fiona grabbed her arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Be careful, Agatha," Fiona hissed. "Marcus wasn't just a bully. He was a collector of secrets, and some secrets are worth killing to keep buried." Agatha shook her off and marched to her car. She needed to think. She needed a drink. But most of all, she needed to know who Marcus Blackwood considered his favorite disappointment. As she drove home, she noticed a black car following her at a discreet distance. The fixer. Agatha's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She had spent 20 years in London prayer making people look better than they were. Now, she was in a sleepy village where everyone was pretending to be better than they were, and the stakes were a lot higher than a bad press release. She wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. She was being watched, and for Agatha Raisin, that was both a terrifying prospect and a deeply flattering one. Chapter 6. The collection of casualties. Agatha sat in her darkened living room, the only light coming from the amber glow of a street lamp outside. She hadn't turned on the lamps, partially to save on her soaring electric bill, and partially because she didn't want the shark-eyed man in the black car who was currently idling 2 houses down to know She was staring at him through the slats of her Venetian blinds. "I'm being stalked, Hodge," she whispered to the cat, who was busy grooming a back leg with utter indifference. "It's practically a compliment. It means I'm onto something. But what?" The list of people Marcus Blackwood had been squeezing was longer than the queue for a Cotswold Christmas market. The vicar, Julian, Fiona, everyone had a motive. But favourite disappointment sounded personal. It sounded like family, or perhaps a long-suffering employee. Agatha decided that if she couldn't find the answer in the village gossip, she would find it in the one place everyone forgot to look, the paper trail. The next morning, Agatha performed a manoeuvre she called the PR pivot. She dressed in her most sombre, professional charcoal suit, the one she used to wear to fire junior executives, and drove to the village hall. The hall was being cleaned after the police had finally released the scene. She found the teenage volunteer from the night of the murder, a lanky boy named Toby, who looked like he was composed entirely of elbows and acne. He was mopping the floor where Blackwood had fallen. "Morning, Toby," Agatha said, her voice dropping into its most authoritative London tone. "The police asked me to check if any personal effects were left behind. Private matter for the estate, you understand." Toby looked terrified. "Oh, right. Yeah, there was a bag of stuff found under the table. I put it in the kitchen." Agatha marched into the kitchen before he could ask for identification. On the counter sat a cardboard box containing a few discarded programs, a broken heel from someone's shoe, and a leather-bound folio. Agatha's heart skipped. She opened the folio. It was Blackwood's personal organizer. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for names. Most of it was boring business. Jargon, land acquisition, permit bribes, drainage costs. But then she saw it. An entry for the day of the murder, 4:30 p.m., the mill. Final warning, LBLB. Agatha's mind raced. Who was L.B.? Larry Bishop, the local butcher? No, he was far too busy arguing about the price of sausages. Lucy Benson? No, she was 94 and lived in a nursing home. Then it hit her. Lawrence Blackwood. Marcus had a son. Agatha remembered hearing a snippet of gossip months ago about a black sheep who had been sent away to boarding school and then vanished into a haze of gambling debts and disappointment. Agatha. What on earth are you doing? Agatha spun around, tucking the folio under her arm with the practiced ease of a shoplifter. It was Mrs. Bloxby. The vicar's wife looked uncharacteristically stern, her usual softness replaced by a sharp, searching gaze. "Just tidying up, Margaret," Agatha said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Such a mess the police left." "You shouldn't be here, Agatha. The inspector was very clear about people interfering. And you've upset Fiona terribly. She's been in tears all morning. Fiona Bradley cries if a loaf of bread doesn't rise properly." Agatha snapped, her temper flaring. "The girl is a professional victim, and she was at the mill, Margaret. She lied about it." Mrs. Bloxby sighed, her expression softening into pity. "We all have things we'd rather keep private, Agatha, even you. But hounding people won't bring that man back. Perhaps it's best to let the law handle it." "The law couldn't find its own backside with both hands and a flashlight," Agatha retorted. She pushed past the vicar's wife, the folio heavy against her side. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she saw the black car again. It pulled out from the curb the moment she appeared. Agatha didn't go home. Instead, she drove toward the manor house. If Lawrence Blackwood was the favourite disappointment, he might be lurking at his father's estate, waiting for the inheritance to drop into his lap. The gates to Carsely Manor were imposing, topped with stone lions that looked as grumpy as Agatha felt. She drove up the long, winding drive, noticing how the garden, once a pride of the county, was overgrown and choked with weeds. Marcus had clearly cared more about the land's value than its beauty. She parked in front of the massive oak doors and hammered the brass knocker. After a long minute, the door creaked open. A young man stood there. He looked like a blurred, softened version of Marcus Blackwood, same heavy jaw, but with eyes that were watery and tired. He was holding a day, glass of amber liquid that definitely wasn't apple juice. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice slurring slightly. "Are you Lawrence?" Agatha asked, her voice blunt as a hammer. The young man blinked. Larry. Yeah, who are you? Another creditor. Agatha Raisin. I was with your father when he died. Larry's expression didn't change. He didn't look sad. He looked exhausted. Poor old dad. Finally popped his cork, did he? I suppose you want to talk about the funeral. I want to talk about the mill, Agatha said, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. And I want to talk about why your father called you his favorite disappointment. Larry froze. The glass in his hand trembled. He looked toward the top of the grand staircase, as if expecting his father's ghost to appear and roar at him. He told you that, Larry whispered. No, he told Fiona Bradley, but he had a meeting with LB at the mill at 4:30. That was you, wasn't it? Larry took a long, shaky gulp of his drink. I went there to ask for money again. He told me he was cutting me out of the will entirely. He said he was going to leave everything to a trust for the preservation of commercial interests. He laughed at me, Agatha. He told me I wasn't worth the dirt on his boots. And did you kill him for it? I didn't have to, Larry said, a strange, twisted smile touching his lips. When I left him, he was already coughing. He'd been drinking from that flask of his. He told me he'd found a new friend in the village who understood him better than I ever did, someone who appreciated his vision. Agatha felt a chill. Who? Did he give a name? No, Larry said, leaning against the doorframe, but he said they were pure village gold, and he was wearing a flower in his lapel that he hadn't had earlier, a sprig of dried lavender. Agatha's mind flashed back to the bakery. The bunches of dried lavender hanging from the rafters, the smell of cinnamon and smugness. She turned and ran back to her car, her mind screaming. She had been looking for a victim of blackmail. But what if the motive wasn't hate? What if it was a twisted kind of partnership? As she sped down the drive, she checked her rearview mirror. The black car was gone, but as she rounded the corner toward the village, a white hatchback pulled out from a side lane, following her with terrifying, silent precision. Chapter 7. The fragrance of deception. Agatha's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The white hatchback in her rearview mirror remained at a constant, chilling distance. Every time she sped up, it mimicked her pace. When she slowed, it lingered, a ghostly predator in the fading afternoon light. "It's Fiona," Agatha hissed, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "The little minx is actually going to ram me off the road." But the car didn't ram her. As Agatha swerved onto the narrow lane leading to her own cottage, the white vehicle suddenly peeled away, disappearing down a track toward the lower meadows. Agatha pulled into her drive, scrambled out of the car, and bolted inside, locking the door and leaning against it until her breathing slowed. She felt a strange, prickly sensation on the back of her neck. She wasn't safe. The folio she had borrowed from the village hall was still clutched in her hand. She marched into the kitchen, tossed it onto the table, and began flipping through the back pages, the parts she hadn't had time to scan at the hall. There, tucked into a small pocket at the very back, was a folded piece of stationery. It wasn't the cheap, mass-produced paper used by the village council. It was thick, cream-coloured, and smelled faintly of lavender. "My dearest Marcus," the note began in a delicate, looping hand. "Our arrangement is progressing perfectly. The others are so distracted by their own petty fears that they haven't noticed the shift in tide. I look forward to our celebration at the supper. Do be careful with the vintage. It's quite potent." There was no signature, just a small hand-drawn sketch of a sprig of lavender. Agatha felt a cold wave of realization. This wasn't a note from a victim. This was a note from a co-conspirator. Fiona Bradley hadn't been fighting Marcus Blackwood. She had been working with him. The rent increase story was a smokescreen, a way to play the victim and keep the village's sympathy, while she helped Blackwood identify which properties were ripe for the picking. "The little Judas," Agatha muttered. She was feeding him the village secrets. She knew who was vulnerable, who was in debt, who was desperate. She was his scout. But if they were partners, why kill him? Agatha's eyes moved to the line. "Do be careful with the vintage. It's quite potent." Agatha grabbed her handbag and ran back to the car. She didn't care about the stalker anymore. She needed to see the one person who knew more about the village's liquid intake than anyone else. James Lacey. James was Agatha's neighbour, a retired military man with a rigid posture and a devastatingly handsome face that had caused Agatha no end of romantic grief. He was also a connoisseur of fine wines and a man who noticed every detail of social etiquette. She hammered on his door until he opened it, looking startled in his cardigan and reading glasses. "Agatha, it's nearly 7 o'clock. I was just about to James, don't be tedious. I need to know about the wine at the supper," Agatha interrupted, pushing her way into his hallway. "You were sitting at the far end of the table. You saw the service." James sighed, closing the door. It was a standard Chilean merlot, Agatha, hardly worth a forensic investigation. Though, now that you mention it, Blackwood's glass was different. Agatha froze. Different how? He didn't drink the merlot. He had his own bottle of vintage Bordeaux. I assumed it was his usual arrogance, bringing his own superior vintage to a charity event. He poured it himself from a decanter that was sitting at the bar. "Who put the decanter there, James?" James frowned, his military mind searching through the evening's memories. "I believe I saw Fiona Bradley carrying it from the kitchen. She said Marcus had requested it be decanted an hour before he arrived. She seemed quite helpful about it." "Helpful," Agatha spat. "She was decanting his death warrant." "Agatha, that's a very serious accusation," James said, his voice dropping an octave. "Do you have proof?" "I have a note, James, and I have the word of his son that Marcus had a new friend who appreciated his vision. But why would she kill her golden goose? If they were partners in the redevelopment, she stood to make a fortune. Unless, James mused, the arrangement had soured, or perhaps Marcus was planning to cut her out, just like he did his son. He wasn't known for his loyalty. Agatha paced the length of James's rug, her mind whirring. The note said, "It's quite potent." She wasn't warning him, she was mocking him. She knew he couldn't resist a vintage Bordeaux. He was a glutton for the best of everything. "Where are you going?" James asked as Agatha turned back toward the door. "To find that decanter," Agatha said. "The police missed it because they were looking for a heart attack. If I can find the glass or the bottle, I can prove it. Agatha, stay here. If Fiona is as cold-blooded as you think, she won't just let you walk away with evidence." "I've dealt with worse than a baker in linen, James," Agatha said, though her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. "I've dealt with London journalists." She stepped out into the night. The village was silent, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. But as she walked toward her car, she noticed something that made her heart stop. A small, dried sprig of lavender had been tucked under her windshield wiper. It wasn't a gift, it was a mark. Agatha looked around, the shadows of the trees stretching like long, dark fingers. Across the road, she was no longer the hunter. She was the favorite disappointment of a killer who had already proven that one sip was all it took to end a life. She climbed into her car, locked the doors, and drove not to the police, and not to the hall. She drove toward the old mill. If Fiona was going to finish what she started, Agatha knew exactly where she would be waiting, because in the village of Carsely, all secrets eventually flowed down to the water. Chapter 8. The Midnight Mill. The old mill sat like a hunched, rotting beast in the moonlight. Agatha pulled her SUV into the thicket of willows several yards back, cutting the engine and the lights. Silence rushed in, heavy and damp. "I am an idiot," Agatha whispered to the darkened dashboard. "I am a 50-ish woman in a ruined silk dress, sitting in a swamp, playing at being Sherlock Holmes when I should be at home with a gin and a hot bath." But the image of Fiona Bradley's practiced, doe-eyed innocence kept her moving. It was the insult of it, the idea that a girl with a rolling pin and a collection of organic flour could outmaneuver a woman who had handled some of the most ruthless egos in London. Agatha climbed out of the car, her heels sinking instantly into the mire. She had swapped her stilettos for a pair of old gardening sneakers. She kept in the trunk, but the chill seeped through the canvas. She moved toward the mill, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. The decanter, a hidden stash of poison, a secret ledger. The door to the mill house groaned as she pushed it open. The interior was a graveyard of rusted machinery and cobwebs. Moonlight filtered through the jagged holes in the roof, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. Agatha clicked on her small penlight, the beam cutting a weak path through the gloom. "Fiona," she called out, her voice sounding thin and brittle. "I know you're here, or your fixer is. I know about the note and I know about the vintage." There was no answer, only the sound of the river rushing beneath the floorboards. She moved deeper into the structure, toward the back room where the mill wheel had once turned. There, sitting on a crate in the center of the room, was the decanter. It was heavy lead crystal, sparkling incongruously in the dust. Next to it sat a small brown glass bottle with a handwritten label, "Lavender Essence minus extra potent." Agatha stepped forward, her eyes wide. So simple, a concentrated digitalis, or some other cardiac stimulant masked by a floral scent. You didn't just want him dead, you wanted it to look like his own gluttony killed him. It was his gluttony in a way, a soft, breathy voice said from the shadows. Agatha spun around. Fiona Bradley stood in the doorway, but the woman Agatha saw was not the village sweetheart. Her posture was rigid, her face devoid of the habitual softness. In her hand she held a heavy iron fire poker she must have scavenged from the manor. "He was going to ruin everything, Agatha," Fiona said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He promised we would be partners. He said he'd fund the expansion of the bakery, give me the lease on the whole high street. But he was going to betray me. He was going to sell the land to a Dutch conglomerate and leave me with nothing but a thank you and a pat on the head." "So you poisoned his private vintage," Agatha said, trying to keep her voice steady while calculating the distance to the door. "I gave him what he wanted," Fiona countered. "He wanted a thrill, he wanted the best. I just ensured it was his last." "And the man in the black car, the fixer?" Fiona let out a short, sharp laugh. "He wasn't a fixer, Agatha. He was a private investigator Marcus hired to watch me. Marcus didn't trust anyone. That man followed you because he thought you were my accomplice. He was trying to find out what I was hiding. You've been very helpful, actually, leading him on a wild goose chase while I cleaned up." "You haven't cleaned up well enough," Agatha snapped, her old PR bravado returning. "The police have the folio. They have the note." Fiona's eyes flickered. "The note is unsigned, and the folio was in your possession, Agatha. A woman known for her imaginative approach to the truth. Who do you think the village will believe? The girl who feeds them every morning, or the abrasive Londoner who keeps poking her nose where it doesn't belong?" Fiona stepped into the room, the iron poker swinging slightly at her side. "It's a shame, really. I quite liked you, in a terrifying sort of way. But you're a disappointment, Agatha. My favorite disappointment." Agatha felt a jolt of cold terror, the phrase the same one Marcus had used. Fiona hadn't just been Marcus's partner. She had been his protégé. She had learned his cruelty and polished it with a Cotswold shine. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Agatha said, backing away toward the edge of the mill wheel pit. "And why not? Because," Agatha said, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across her face despite her fear. "I'm not the only one who likes to poke their nose into things." From the shadows behind Fiona, a tall, solid figure emerged. James Lacey stepped into the moonlight, his face set in a grim, military line. He wasn't holding a poker, he was holding his mobile phone, the screen glowing with an active recording. "I believe we have more than enough for Inspector Wilkes now," James said quietly. Fiona lunged, but she was a baker, not a brawler. James caught her arm with practiced ease, twisting the poker from her grip. She slumped to the floor, the doe-eyed mask finally shattering into a jagged mess of tears and rage. Agatha let out a long, shuddering breath. She leaned against a rusted gear, her heart finally slowing. "You followed me, James." "Of course I followed you, Agatha," James said, looking at her with a mixture of exasperation and something that looked suspiciously like admiration. "You were wearing sneakers with a silk dress. I knew you were up to something dangerous." Agatha smoothed her hair, trying to reclaim some dignity. "Well, I suppose I should call Wilkes, though I hate to give him the satisfaction of being right about the cardiac event part." Actually, James said, glancing at the decanter, I think you'll find the satisfaction is all yours. You solved it, Agatha, again. Agatha looked at the ruined mill, the broken girl on the floor, and the handsome man standing by her side. She felt a brief, flickering moment of triumph. It wouldn't last. The village would be a nightmare of gossip by morning, and she still had a dry cleaning bill that would make a banker weep. But for now, as the moon hung over the Cotswolds, Agatha Raisin felt exactly what she always wanted to be, the center of the story. Chapter 9. The social trap. The drive back from the mill was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a third passenger in Agatha's SUV. James had insisted on driving her, citing her visibly rattling nerves, though Agatha would have preferred to call it justified adrenaline. Fiona had been left in the grim, efficient custody of Bill Wong, who had arrived at the mill with a speed that suggested James had called the police long before he stepped out of the shadows. By the time the sun began to peek over the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, Agatha was tucked into her sofa, wrapped in a cashmere throw that had cost more than her first car. James was in her kitchen, making tea with the focused intensity of a man defusing a bomb. I suppose you think you're very clever, Agatha shouted toward the kitchen. James appeared in the doorway, 2 mugs in hand. I think you're lucky, Agatha. If I hadn't seen you sneaking out of your drive with that look in your eye, the one you get when you've decided to be particularly difficult, we'd be fishing you out of the Windrush. I had everything under control, Agatha huffed, though she took the tea gratefully. I was just drawing her out. It's a PR tactic. Provoke a response to control the narrative. You provoked a woman with a lethal piece of ironmongery, James noted, sitting in the armchair opposite her. But you were right about the favorite disappointment. It wasn't Larry. Marcus was grooming Fiona to be his successor. He saw himself in her the ruthlessness, the ability to manipulate. But he forgot that a student of a shark eventually learns how to bite. Agatha stared into her tea. The triumph she had felt at the mill was beginning to curdle into a familiar, nagging loneliness. The village will never forgive me for this. You know, they liked her. She gave them sourdough and smiles. I'm just the loud woman from London who ruined the benevolent fun supper and put the local baker in handcuffs. Nonsense, James said, though he didn't quite meet her eyes. They'll be horrified, of course, but Carsely loves a scandal almost as much as it loves a fate. You'll be the hero of the hour. For a week, at least. Agatha knew James was trying to be kind, which was almost more irritating than his usual aloofness. She didn't want to be a hero of the hour. She wanted to be part of the fabric of the place, not the moth that kept eating holes in its polite illusions. The following afternoon, the fallout began in earnest. Agatha, refusing to hide like a wounded animal, donned a sharp navy blazer and her most formidable pearls and headed for the village green. The atmosphere in Carsely was electric. Groups of neighbours stood on street corners, their voices dropping to a low buzz as Agatha approached. At the post office, Mrs. Wellington looked as though she had seen a ghost. Agatha, the postmistress whispered, her eyes darting around. Is it true about Fiona? They say the police found a whole laboratory of poisons in her pantry behind the gluten-free flour. It wasn't a laboratory, Mrs. Wellington, Agatha said, with a bored wave of her hand. It was a bottle of essence, and a great deal of resentment. A common enough recipe. She continued her walk, her head held high, though her heart sank as she passed the crusty corner. The shop was shuttered, a closed until further notice sign hanging crookedly in the window. The smell of cinnamon was gone, replaced by the sterile scent of police tape. She was intercepted near the War Memorial by Julian Vance. He looked haggard, his silver hair uncombed. Agatha, he said, stepping into her path. I wanted to apologize for what I said at your cottage. You were right about Marcus, and you were right to be suspicious. I was just so terrified of what he could do to me that I couldn't see what was happening right in front of us. Agatha felt a flicker of her old attraction to him, but it was dampened by a new, cold clarity. You were a victim of his, Julian, but you were also willing to let me look like a fool to protect your own skin. That's the trouble with this village. Everyone is so busy protecting their reputations that they forget to protect their souls. Julian looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Agatha didn't wait for a response. She marched on, feeling a strange, hollow sense of power. She had won. She had solved the case, saved the vicar's reputation, and exposed a killer. But as she looked at the picturesque cottages and the neatly trimmed hedges, she realized that she had also torn a hole in the villages. Comfort, they didn't want the truth, they wanted the sourdough. She returned home to find a small hand-delivered envelope on her mat. It was from Mrs. Bloxby. "My dear Agatha," it read. "The vicar and I would be honoured if you would join us for a quiet supper at the vicarage tonight. Just the three of us. We have much to thank you for, and I believe there is a very nice bottle of non-lethal sherry with your name on it." Agatha felt a lump in her throat. She looked at Hodge, who was batting at a stray piece of lavender that had fallen from her coat. "Well," Agatha told the cat, "at least one person in this place knows how to write a proper invitation." She went upstairs to change. She chose a simple, elegant dress. Nothing green, nothing silk, and certainly nothing that required her to hold her breath. As she looked in the mirror, she didn't pull at her jawline. She just looked at herself, Agatha Raisin, detective, nuisance, and survivor. The reveal was over. The villain was caught. But in Carsely, the real mystery was always how to survive the next morning's gossip. And Agatha, as always, was ready for the challenge. Chapter 10. The bitter aftertaste of victory. The vicarage was a sanctuary of peeling wallpaper, sagging bookshelves, and the comforting dusty scent of old hymnals. It was a far cry from the sleek, aggressive luxury of Marcus Blackwood's manor, or the stage-managed perfection of Fiona's bakery. As Agatha sat in the parlour, sipping a glass of sherry that was, as promised, entirely devoid of digitalis, she felt the tension of the last few days finally begin to ebb. Margaret Bloxby sat opposite her, knitting something shapeless and grey. "The village is in a state of shock, of course," Margaret said, her needles clicking a steady rhythm. "But shock is often followed by a very healthy sense of relief. You've done a brave thing, Agatha." "I've done a tactless thing, Margaret. Let's be honest," Agatha sighed, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress. "I've exposed the fact that our local sweetheart was a cold-blooded opportunist, and that our late property developer was a blackmailer who had half the parish council under his thumb. I don't think I'll be invited to many tea parties this month." The vicar entered, carrying a tray of shepherd's pie. He looked 10 years younger. The shadow of Blackwood's threats had vanished, replaced by his usual air of mild, scholarly confusion. "On the contrary, Agatha, you've saved the community orchard, with Blackwood's estate in probate and Larry. Well, Larry being Larry. The development plans have been shelved indefinitely. The village owes you a debt." "I'd settle for a decent dry cleaner who can handle red wine stains," Agatha muttered, though she felt a small, stubborn glow of pride. They ate in a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have seen each other at their worst and decided to keep the friendship anyway. But as the evening wore on, Agatha's mind drifted. She thought of Fiona Bradley, currently sitting in a cell in Gloucester, and wondered at the sheer icy nerve it took to bake scones while planning a murder. She was so young, Agatha mused aloud, swirling the last of her sherry. To have that much hate in her, it seems such a waste. "It wasn't hate, Agatha," Mrs. Bloxby said gently, looking up from her knitting. "It was ambition. The same kind of ambition that drives people in your old world of London. She simply brought it to a place where people weren't looking for it. She hid her thorns behind lavender." Agatha nodded slowly. She understood ambition. She had spent her life climbing over others to reach the top of the PR mountain, only to find the view from the summit a bit lonely. Fiona was just a darker reflection of that same drive, a mirror image of Agatha. Had Agatha lacked a conscience? When it was time to leave, the vicar walked Agatha to the door. The Cotswold night was still and silent, the stars hanging low over the gables of the village. "Good night, Agatha," Alfie said, giving her hand a grateful squeeze. "And thank you, truly." Agatha walked back to her cottage, her heels crunching on the gravel. She passed Julian Vance's house and noticed the lights were out. He had retreated into his own shame, and Agatha found she didn't particularly care. The romantic flutter she had felt for him had been replaced by a sharp, clear-eyed realism. He was a man who preferred a quiet life to a just one. And Agatha Raisin was not a woman for a quiet life. She reached her own gate and paused. A figure was standing by the stone wall, the glowing cherry of a cigarette, the only light. "You're late," James Lacey said, pushing himself off the wall. "I was at the vicarage. Some of us have social standing, James," Agatha snapped, though her heart gave a traitorous little skip. "I just wanted to make sure you got home, and to tell you that Bill Wong called." The toxicology came back. It was digitalis, just as you thought, mixed into a lavender reduction, high enough concentration to stop a heart in minutes. "I knew it," Agatha said, a note of triumph returning to her voice. "I told Wilkes. I told everyone." "Yes, Agatha, you told the world," James said, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small white paper bag. "Here, I found these at the shop in the next village over. They aren't as artisanal as Fiona's, but I'm told they're edible." Agatha opened the bag. It was a pair of jam donuts, coated in an excessive amount of granulated sugar. "Donuts, James, really? I thought you might need the sugar for your next campaign of interference." He turned and walked toward his own house before she could think of a witty retort. Agatha watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of exasperation and contentment. She went inside, where Hodge was waiting by his empty bowl, let out a long sigh, and kicked off her shoes. She sat at her kitchen table, eating a donut, and staring at the wall. The excitement was over. The village would eventually find someone else to gossip about, and Agatha would return to her battle against the local weeds and the slow, steady march of time. But as she licked the sugar from her fingers, she caught a faint, lingering scent. She panicked for a second, thinking of lavender, before realizing it was just the smell of the old floor polish the vicarage used. She wasn't a victim, she wasn't a disappointment. She was Agatha Raisin, the sharpest tongue in the Cotswolds, and God help the next person who tried to ruin her dinner party. She picked up her notepad, turned to a fresh page, and wrote, "Note to self, buy more gin, and perhaps a new dress. Something in red, blood red." Outside, the owls hooted in the trees, and the village of Carsely slept, its secrets tucked away for another day, while its most reluctant detective finally closed her eyes. Chapter 11. The final audit the following week in Carsely was marked by a silence so profound it felt like the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for the smoke to clear. The crusty corner was no longer just closed, it was a crime scene. A small handwritten sign had appeared in the window of the village shop, "No sourdough until further notice." Plain white only. It was the ultimate Cotswold tragedy. Agatha sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of newspapers. She had made the regional press, retired PR guru sniffs out bakery poisoner, and even earned a cynical paragraph in the London tabloids. Her old colleagues had called, half mocking and half impressed, but Agatha had found herself cutting the conversations short. Their world of artificial crises and carefully managed brands felt hollow compared to the raw, messy reality of Marcus Blackwood's greed and Fiona's cold calculation. There was, however, one final piece of business to attend to. Agatha dressed with clinical precision, a charcoal grey suit, a crisp white blouse, and her most intimidating spectacles. She wasn't playing the detective today. She was playing the auditor. She drove to the old rectory, Julian Vance's grand house, and parked her SUV directly across his driveway, blocking any potential escape. Julian opened the door looking like a man who had spent the week sleeping in his clothes. The silver hair was dull, and the charming smile was nowhere to be found. "Agatha," he said, his voice flat, "I suppose you've come to gloat." "Don't be pathetic, Julian. I've come for the documents," Agatha said, stepping past him into the hallway. "The documents? The ones Marcus was using to blackmail you. The ones Larry said his father was carrying at the mill. I know they weren't in the folio I took from the hall, and I know the police didn't find them on Fiona. That leaves you." Julian led her into his study, a room filled with expensive drafting tables and rolls of blueprints. He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. "I went back to the mill that night, after you and James left, but before the police cordoned it off properly, I found them dropped in the reeds. Agatha opened the folder. It wasn't a minor clerical error, as Julian had claimed. It was evidence of a massive structural cover-up in a London skyscraper project, a shortcut that had saved a developer millions, but could have cost lives. It was enough to put Julian in prison, not just end his career. You had more reason to kill him than anyone, Agatha said softly, looking at the papers. I didn't do it, Agatha, I swear. I went to the mill to pay him off. I had the money in my car, but when I got there he was already erratic. He told me he didn't want my money anymore. He said he had found a better investment. He threw the folder at me and told me to get out of his sight. Agatha looked at him, seeing the cowardice that had kept him silent while a murderer walked the village streets. And you were just going to keep these. Let the village think he died of a heart attack while you sat on the truth. I was scared, Julian whispered. Agatha snapped the folder shut. You're a disappointment, Julian, but unlike Marcus, I don't have a favourite. I'm taking these to the authorities in London, not Wilkes, someone who actually understands corporate crime. You'll have to face the music for what you did there, but at least you won't have a murder hanging over your head. As she walked to her car, Agatha felt a strange sense of closure. She had stripped away the last of the village's polite masks. There was no more mystery, only the dull, grey light of the truth. She drove back through the village, passing the green where the primary school children were playing. She saw Mrs. Bloxby outside the church, waving at her with a genuine warm smile. Agatha didn't stop. She needed to get home. When she walked into her cottage, she found a package on her doorstep. There was no return address, only a note written in a familiar blocky hand. For the dry, cleaning inside was a beautiful vintage silk scarf, in a deep, vibrant emerald green. There was no name, but the scent of James Lacey's tobacco lingered on the silk. Agatha draped the scarf around her neck, looking at herself in the hallway mirror. She didn't look like a London PR professional anymore. She looked like a woman who belonged in the Cotswolds, not because she fit in, but because she was the only one brave enough to stand out. She went into the kitchen, poured herself a gin and tonic, mostly gin, and sat down with Hodge. "Well, Hodge," she said, raising her glass to the empty room, "that's that. Murder solved, reputations ruined, and I've got a new scarf. I suppose I should start thinking about the Christmas fete." She took a long sip, the bite of the gin warming her throat. For the first time in weeks, the air in the cottage didn't smell of lavender or cinnamon or damp earth. It just smelled like home. Agatha Raisin leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and waited for the phone to ring. In a village like Carsely, it was only a matter of time before someone else did something terribly inconvenient. And when they did, Agatha would be ready. Chapter 12. The long shadow of the hill life in Carsely had a peculiar way of folding back over a scandal, much like a heavy wool blanket being tucked around a shivering child. Within a fortnight, the sensational arrest of Fiona Bradley had shifted from a shocking tragedy to a staple of the Wednesday morning coffee mornings, a tale to be told with a shudder and a second slice of lemon drizzle cake. Agatha, however, found the transition back to normalcy more irritating than the mystery itself. She sat in her garden, wrapped in a thick cardigan, despite the pale spring sun, watching a pair of blue tits fight over the bird feeder. The emerald scarf James had left her was tucked into her collar, a soft silken reminder that she wasn't entirely an island. A sharp rap on the garden gate broke her reverie. It was Bill Wong. He looked tired, his uniform slightly rumpled, but he carried a file under his arm that suggested the paperwork was finally catching up to the drama. "Agatha," he said, leaning over the gate, "I thought you'd want to know. The formal charges were laid this morning. Fiona isn't talking much, but her solicitor is already pushing for a diminished responsibility plea. Something about the unbearable pressure of Marcus Blackwood's demands." Agatha snorted, a sharp, unladylike sound. Unbearable pressure. The girl had a heart like a pebble. She didn't snap. "Bill," she calculated, "there's a difference." Bill sighed, opening the gate and joining her on the patio. "Perhaps, but in court." pressured baker plays better than ruthless opportunist. Wilkes is just happy it's over. He's already taking credit in the local rag for meticulous forensic coordination. Meticulous. He couldn't find a dead body in a mortuary, Agatha snapped. Did you tell him about the lavender essence? I told him we found it. I neglected to mention that you found it first, while trespassing in a derelict mill and nearly getting your head caved in. I thought it might save you a formal caution. Agatha felt a rare surge of gratitude toward the young detective. Thank you, Bill, though I still think the police should reimburse me for that emerald dress. It was a business expense. Solving murders isn't your business, Agatha. You're retired. I'm beginning to think retirement is just a polite word for waiting to be annoyed, she grumbled. After Bill left, Agatha decided she couldn't sit still a moment longer. She needed to see the village not as a crime scene, but as her home. She walked down to the high street, her head held high. The reaction was subtle but telltale. Mr. Pendlebury, the grocer, gave her a hesitant nod. Mrs. Wellington, at the post office, actually offered a tight, nervous smile. They were afraid of her, Agatha realized, not because they thought she was dangerous, but because she saw too much. She was the woman who pulled back the curtains, and in a place like Carsely, that was a power more formidable than the law. She stopped at the churchyard, leaning against the cold stone wall. The community orchard land lay just beyond, a stretch of green that had nearly been paved over by Marcus's greed and Fiona's complicity. Because of Agatha, it was still there. The trees would bloom, the fruit would grow, and eventually people would forget why they were allowed to sit there in the sun. It looks peaceful, doesn't it? Agatha didn't need to turn around to recognize the dry, clipped tone. James Lacey was standing a few feet away, his hands deep in his pockets. It looks like work, Agatha countered. I hear the vicar wants a volunteer committee to clear the brambles. I suppose you'll be the chairman. I was thinking of nominating you, Agatha. You're very good at clearing away things that shouldn't be there. Agatha looked at him, searching for a trace of mockery, but found only a quiet, grudging respect. I've had enough of brambles for one season, James, and I've had enough of village gold. I think I'll stick to my own garden for a while. I doubt that, James said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You're already bored. I can see it in the way you're tapping your foot. Agatha stopped tapping immediately. I am not bored. I am reflecting. Well, reflect on this, James said, stepping closer. There's a new couple moving into the old forge. Rumour has it they're from London, and they've already managed to offend the parish council by suggesting the church bells are too loud. Agatha's ears pricked up. Her eyes sharpened, the boredom vanishing like mist in the sun. Londoners. At the forge. Well, they'll need someone to tell them how things are done here. Someone who understands both worlds. I thought you might say that, James murmured. As they walked back toward Lilac Lane together, the shadows of the Cotswold hills lengthened across the road. Agatha felt the familiar weight of village life settling back into place, the petty rivalries, the quiet secrets, and the inevitable drama of people living too close for comfort. Fiona Bradley was gone, and Marcus Blackwood was buried, but the heart of Carsely beat on, as stubborn and complicated as Agatha herself. She reached her cottage door and paused, looking back at James. Dinner on Friday, James. I'll cook. And I promise no mushrooms, no vintage Bordeaux, and absolutely no lavender, James chuckled. Friday it is, Agatha, but I'm bringing the wine. I'd like to live to see Saturday. Agatha watched him walk away, her heart feeling unexpectedly light. She went inside where Hodge was waiting with an expectant meow. She picked up the cat, buried her face in his fur, and looked out the window at the darkening sky. The mystery of the last guest was solved, but for Agatha Raisin, the real story was only just beginning. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was the guardian of the gate, the thorn in the side of the smug, and the only woman in the Cotswolds who knew exactly what happened when the lights went out in the village hall. She smiled, a sharp, brilliant, and thoroughly dangerous smile. Well, Hodge, she whispered, I wonder what the people at the forge are like. I think it's only neighbourly to go and find out.